Hi everyone, this is Axel from dreamsanctuary.net. Here is another dream that I feel will be valuable to go through. As usual, I will follow the dream guide that can be downloaded from my website. Let's start straight away with step 1. I had this dream in May 2023 and I titled it, "The discarded water makes the whole world." Here is what I remember. Jonathan Pajot says that the discarded water makes the whole world and that it is true according to scripture. Then I see water flowing. It splits into usable water on one hand and non-usable discarded water on the other. The discarded water starts to shine by refraction like a diamond, and the colored reflections created that way were constellating images of the world. I try to represent this by two pictures. On the left you can see the water gaining those rainbow-like tones by refractions, and then on the right you can see the reflection starting to create a world. On the next step we'll go through the key symbols and their associations. So once again Jonathan Pajot shows up, and here I associate him with orthodoxy, which means the right, true, correct doxa. So something that is fundamentally true. And this links with the next symbol, scripture, which for me is the idea of a sacred telos. So the way things develop or evolve, move towards a final goal, a final purpose that is of a sacred nature. The main symbol is the usable water and the discarded water, and I thought about it as integrated and non-integrated water. In Genesis, we have this simplification of the separation of the water above and the water below. Because water is showing up in this dream and it's one of the most frequent symbols you find when dealing with the unconscious, I thought I would quote Jung here, saying that water is the commonest symbol for the unconscious. Psychologically, therefore, water means spirit that has become unconscious. For my personal context, I finished an article named Grieving the Father that was quite important for me to write, and I was busy preparing a presentation on this article. Yet this does not feel related to the dream. So the only context that is left is that this was one of the 6 dreams I had that night. I can't give the whole 6 dreams, but I can try to summarize them this way. The first dream was an invitation from the feminine, and I was participating in a very strict church. Then I had this dream, and the next 3 dreams something goes wrong. At first I can't get a subway pass, then I send the wrong URL, and the last dream was a failed first contact. We'll come back to this point later. So what is this dream moment by moment? At first the setting is orthodoxy and telos. The feeling here is that I'm grounded in something true and something important. And the next moment I see the split of the water. And this is not really a feeling, but we've moved from the theoretical to the experiential. And the last moment is I see the discarded water shimmering, the refractions, the reflection, and those piecewise aspects of the world. And here my feeling is of a positive surprise, the wow you would have when you see a hologram for the first time. With all those elements we can move to the interpretation. As we've said, it starts with me being presented with something true and important. And that thing is that the world is constituted not by water, but by discarded water. And this telos or purpose is of a sacred nature. So the main element here is that some of the water can be integrated, which you can think about being able to use straight away, but some can't. This led me to consider the idea of river of life, that we are all in our own river, and depending on the attitude of the ego, we flow more or less well with it. And so if we were to not flow with it, it would build up and try to drag us back into our own river of life. And that's what the next part presents, is that the discarded water starts to shimmer and the colored reflection creates this whole world. So the water that has not yet been integrated into the personality creates a world which is a place of experience. Why? For us to experience, for us to become more aware or more conscious of what has been dismissed. And so that's my interpretation, that unintegrated contents don't go away. They will reappear under a new phenomenological form. This fits very well by a quote from Jung that says, "The psychic is a phenomenal world in itself, which can be reduced neither to the brain nor to metaphysics." We can go quickly through the checklist. I've demonstrated I'm taking this dream symbolically. And though I knew that dreams and unconscious was important, this dream presents a clarity that I've not had before. For the third point, I don't think there's anything in this dream that would lead to inflation, so it's fine. And for the fourth point, this is clearly about the inner world, because we're dealing with the discarded water. The last step is usually where we try to make the dream concrete with a symbolic act. And at the time where I made this interpretation, it was very satisfying to me, but as usual with those big religious dreams, they're quite abstract, so they are hard to ground in a practical dimension. And this might be why the next dreams something goes wrong. Maybe that's a way for the unconscious to tell me that I could only go so far in my understanding and I would fail a first contact, which is a meeting of the ego with the more other or alien aspect of the psyche. So I'm taking the opportunity of revisiting this dream now that I've read Symbols of Transformation, which is collected work number 5, because a new dimension of this dream appeared to me, which I will try to present now. At the very beginning of Symbols of Transformation, Jung makes a difference between two kinds of thinking. The first one is directed thinking, and it's a slow, effortful, tiring process directed outwards towards the world. And so directed thinking is really reality thinking. It's how we think about the world so we can adapt to it. This is what I'm doing right now. I'm communicating to you with directed thinking. The other kind of thinking is fantasy thinking. This one is effortless, spontaneous, uncontrollable. And it's not turned towards the world, it's turned towards the subjective. And it's generally seen as unproductive. What we're really talking about here is daydreaming. It's when we move from symbols to symbols, emotions to emotions. And it does that continuously because it's associative, so it moves from things that are like each other. And that's how it can jump from things that are not directly related, but unconsciously related by the libido. Here's a quote from Jung. "We have therefore two kinds of thinking, directed thinking and dreaming or fantasy thinking. The former operates with speech elements for the purpose of communication and is difficult and exhausting. The latter is effortless, working as it were spontaneously, with the contents ready to hand and guided by unconscious motives. The one produces innovations and adaptation, copies reality and tries to act upon it. The other turns away from reality, sets free subjective tendencies, and as regards adaptation, is unproductive." At this point, you should notice that directed thinking is close to the usable water of my dream, and fantasy thinking is then the discarded water, which we should focus more on. At first, there's some very strong words on fantasy thinking. It's described as unproductive, infantile, autoerotic, and Jung goes as far as saying it's autistic by quoting Swiss psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler. Here's a quote. "Any lessening of interest or the slightest fatigue is enough to put an end to the delicate psychological adaptation to reality which is expressed through directed thinking and to replace it by fantasies. We wander from the subject and let our thoughts go their own way. If the slackening of attention continues, we gradually lose all sense of the present and fantasy gains the upper hand." Having said that, fantasy thinking is not without a purpose. The goal is compensation, and we can demonstrate that with its very basic example. What do poor people fantasize about? They fantasize about being rich. What do overworked people fantasize? They fantasize about being in holiday or getting at retirement. What do helpless people fantasize about? They fantasize about getting revenge. Same thing with people who are unaccomplished. They dream about grandiose projects, arts, maybe a book that would change mankind. And people who are lonely, they fantasize about being with a partner. The key insight here is that all seek compensation through fantasy. We can see this compensation in cases of maladaptive daydreaming, something I got out of a paper named Representations of Maladaptive Daydreaming and the Self. The first image is someone with headphones lying on a bed and caught inside a bubble of colors. The participant writes, "I drew myself having a daydream experience in my bed. It happens here 95% of the time. The daydream acts like a protecting bubble that makes me forget about all the worries of the world and makes me feel safe." Another intense example is the picture from another participant. Here you can see that all the outside world is black and the inner world coming from a mind is full of colors, intriguing characters, and full of life. This supports the fact that the purpose of fantasy thinking is compensation to the outer world. A third example that's very insightful is the drawing of a spider web by participant 4. He says, "The drawing of the spider web is meant to capture the exclusiveness of my daydreaming experience. Similarly to how a spider is the only creature that can traverse its own web without getting caught, I feel that I am the only person who can fully understand my own imaginary world. Any attempts that have been made by alien forces to venture into my mind thus far have been unsuccessful." As a point of interest, you can really see the mother complex, which is the participant's own capacity for protecting himself from life and yet trapping himself at the same time. This short review of maladaptive daydreaming is not really to focus on daydreaming or fantasies, but to make a point about the generation of symbols. Let's repeat. When there are problems with adaptation to the outer world, what happens to the inner world? Well, Jung tells us that the libido gets stuck in the unconscious and it starts to activate it, and it will generate compensatory symbols. This is what we saw in the dream, that the discarded water starts shimmering and makes the world. Another technical way of saying it is that the introverted libido gives rise to the formation of symbols. If this is true, and I believe it is, then the deeper the problem of adaptation is, the more archaic or mythological the contents will be generated. And this makes sense. If you, let's say, are overworked at home, well, you'll fantasize about your next holiday or your next weekend. But if the problem is very deep, then you might have some kind of impersonal image like fire or water. And then your best luck is to understand those symbols with the help of comparative mythology or depth psychology. The generation of symbols is actually an opportunity for self-knowledge, but the general lack of understanding about how to go about it might turn this process pathological. Here's a visual example of it that I found on Reddit. The user says, "I drew a picture depicting what struggling with maladaptive daydreaming feels like." And you can see this girl chained and forced to go into the water being obviously the unconscious. Under the water, we can see this world of different symbols and various characters, and at the end of the chain, we see a girl that looks like the one who's drowning, but she has a pink dress and she enjoys the process. If you're used to this kind of symbolism, you'll immediately recognize that this female character is the shadow of the one who's drowning, because she has all the repressed qualities of the ego. The ego is drowning, is struggling, and the shadow is actually enjoying the process and trying to force us down. What's really important about this picture is you can see how the ego is forced into its own depth, into this vivid world of symbols, that if everything went well, she would be able to integrate into her personality and come back transformed out of it. To conclude this video, I would like to draw a scenario that contains all the elements discussed so far. We're going to say that after 2020, adaptation to the outer life has gone from difficult to impossible. Your mileage may vary, but for most people, the waters of life are stalled, or at the very least, people feel like they're swimming against the currents. When this happens, part of the libido is stuck in the unconscious and starts to activate more or less deep layers of the unconscious. This means that the symbol-making process will kick in, and this is not just about fantasies, but maybe you have an overactive dream life. Maybe you've developed obsessions or fascination with symbols. Any kind of compulsion, anything that's beyond the control of the ego has an unconscious component to it. If we were to understand this phenomenon properly, we would say that the missing half of adaptation is provided by the unconscious by compensation. And yet those saving contents, those contents that, if they were to be integrated into the personality, would transform it, are impossible to understand. If that's the case, there's going to be a split between the ego and the unconscious. And the compensation is going to become chronic at first, maladaptive, pathological, and may turn fatal. What I'm really talking about here is when an old attitude is not working anymore, the missing parts are provided by the unconscious. And it's only with these elements integrated into the personality that a new attitude can be formed. This can sound like something I'm making up, but this quote from Jung will prove otherwise. When difficult adaptations are demanded, it is forever tempting to make evasions and retreats, to regress to the infantile past, which then starts throwing up the incestuous symbolism. If only this temptation were perfectly clear, it would be possible, with a great effort of will, to free oneself from it. But it is far from clear, because a new adaptation or orientation of vital importance can only be achieved in accordance with the instincts. Lacking this, nothing durable results, only a convulsively willed, artificial product which proves in the long run to be incapable of life. No man can change himself into anything from sheer reason. He can only change into what he potentially is. When such a change becomes necessary, the previous mode of adaptation, already in a state of decay, is unconsciously compensated by the archetype of another mode. If the conscious mind now succeeds in interpreting the constellated archetype in a meaningful and appropriate manner, then a viable transformation can take place. So what is Jung saying here? He's saying that the will is not enough to adapt, that old or new ideas are not enough to adapt. See, many people are trying to will themselves into a mold, but that is denying their instincts and their psyche. This is why depth psychology points at dreams and other unconscious material, because at least they're in tune with nature, they're in tune with the instinct and obviously the psyche. If these contents were to be understood, if a conscious cooperation can take place, we would be able to actualize this potential that is in tune with nature into a reality. And that is how we would be able to move from an old mode to a new mode of adaptation. If we are to deny those contents that are uniquely ours, then we have the following quote. Out of the unconscious flows the well of life, and what you don't accept in yourself naturally falls back into that well and poisons it. And that's why we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Ignoring the unconscious is a recipe for disaster, and yet dealing with the unconscious is not without risk. Jung summarized this problem this way. No one should deny the danger of the descent, but it can be risked. And so if you're one of those people who have an overactive unconscious, you might have to risk the descent.